here and kind of set the table of halacha from my perspective as a Reform rabbi, and then we can have some conversation about differences and similarities and whatnot. So I guess I want to pick up on a couple of things that from Rabbi Ari's framing of it that I think kind of will help you understand how we approach halacha in the Reform setting. So one is the issue of the issue of the binding nature of halacha, and then two is the characterization of halacha as law. We typically translate halacha as Jewish law, and thus the kind of conversation about a court system and so forth, which certainly, exists. I want to offer kind of an additional perspective on the question of halacha as law. But let me first start with the issue of the binding nature of halacha. So if we think of halacha as law, we know law in the sense of law in the American society. There's civil law, there's criminal law. And law is binding in the sense that as citizens of the United States, we have to follow it. If we don't follow the law, we'll go to jail, or we'll have to pay a fine, or there's some kind of, penalty for not following the law, which is enforced by courts and police officers and, a judicial system. In Reform Judaism, we think of halacha a little bit differently. In our frame of thinking, halacha is not binding in that way. First of all, there's no authority that enforces it, right? So if I or anyone chooses, not to observe some aspect of the halacha, I'm not going to be arrested for it. I'm not going to be fined for it. There's no compulsion behind it. So by definition, in our society, regardless of whether we're Reform or Orthodox or anything else, the observance of halacha is voluntary. It wasn't always that way in Jewish history. Before the Enlightenment, when Jewish communities lived in their own communities, they were given authority by the ruling power under which they lived to enforce their own laws, and the Jewish community had its own court system and kind of police powers. And if people didn't follow the halacha, they would be penalized and they could be thrown out of the community. But that changed with the Enlightenment. And now the observance of Jewish law is fundamentally voluntary for everybody, because nobody's going to be arrested for not following it. So in that sense, you have to pair it in Reform Judaism with an ideological principle that governs our worldview, and that is the principle of individual autonomy. So in Reform Judaism, we hold as a core principle that each and every Reform Jew, has autonomy over their own lives, the ultimate authority over their own lives. It's up to us to decide what we're going to do. We're not bound by any kind of authority external to us, even in a kind of a non police power sense. We're our own ultimate kind of religious decision makers, and so that kind of reinforces the fact that our observance is a matter of personal choice and is voluntary. So if that's the case, halacha is voluntary, but it's law. Well, what does that mean? How do we kind of reconcile this idea that law can be something other than, compulsory in the sense that we know it in American society.